Following President Biden's inauguration, Republicans in almost every state introduced legislation designed specifically to prevent people, or certain people, from voting. 2 months later, Georgia became the first state to enact a new voter suppression law. Would you believe that there was a time when Georgia was one of the most progressive states in the country on voting rights? They were. Of course, that time was the 1790s, and things have changed a bit since then, but still, at one time they were among the leaders. In 1789, Georgia became the first state to allow people, well, men, who didn't own property to vote. A decade later, they abolished what is now known as the poll tax. A man could then vote without having to pay the tax first. In the U.S., the 4 main reasons to deny someone the vote have been race, religion, gender, and wealth, or lack of wealth. That was true in the 18th century, and it's true today. But the methods and rationalizations used to keep people from voting have changed. When the Constitution was written, the idea that people could govern themselves was a radical notion. We're taught that we are the first modern democracy. We aren't. But the path to granting power to the people is a long and winding road. The framers didn't really believe that most people had the ability to govern themselves. It's a complex history, and today's voter suppression bills are just as complex, though for a different reason. We're going to look at the twisted, treacherous, and transfixing history of voting rights in the U.S. in this episode of Progressive Solutions. The original version of the Constitution, adopted in 1788, gave states complete power to decide who could vote and who couldn't, and the states, led entirely by white, landowning Protestant men, decided generally to limit voting to white, landowning Protestant men. The New Hampshire state constitution that was adopted in 1776 actually required voters to be men, quote, professing a belief in the faith of any Protestant sect. Even though Article 6 of the Constitution prohibited religious tests or qualifications for federal office, states could impose a religious test for state office or for voting. Women were generally prohibited from voting as well. Few men believed that women were capable of making the rational decisions needed to vote intelligently. Even the liberal John Adams, whose wife Abigail urged him to respect women's needs and rights, wrote a letter saying that women shouldn't be allowed to vote because their delicacy renders them unfit for practice and experience in the great business of life and the hardy enterprises of war, as well as the arduous cares of state. Besides, their attention is so much engaged with the necessary nurture of their children that nature has made them fittest for domestic cares. Almost all men of that age, and a lot of men today, still believe that. Women had to fight state by state and territory by territory, as 4 territories granted voting rights to women before any state did, as well as at the national level, until the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote. Interestingly, several states allowed women to vote for school board first. The belief was that since women were the natural nurturers and that since raising children was what they were made for, it also made sense for them to vote for the people who would be in charge of educating their children. One state where women could vote early on was New Jersey, whose 1776 state constitution granted voting rights to adults who had been in the state for 1 year and who were worth 50 pounds, which meant pretty much everybody who owned land and a few people who didn't. Now, while married women couldn't legally own land because their husbands were the official owners, single and widowed women could own land, and many did, and many of them voted. And nobody cared. Until they changed the Constitution in 1807 to limit voting to adult, white, male, tax-paying citizens. There are plenty of great histories of the fight to gain voting rights by women, so I'll just add that the 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, New York, was 72 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment, and even then, women had been fighting for the vote for a long time. Which brings us to race. The entire concept of race has a long history. The biblical story of Noah has often been interpreted to have racial meanings. His 3 sons represented 3 races. Shem represented the Semitic race, Ham the Hamitic or black race, and Japheth the Indo-European or white race. By the time the U.S. was founded, racial views in the new states were based almost entirely on the notion that the white race was inherently superior to the black race. Even the most ardent abolitionists believed that freed slaves should be deported rather than live side by side with whites. As a result, states generally prohibited black people from voting. Even states that didn't specifically prohibit people from voting based on race pretty much made it impossible for even a freed black man to vote. During the early decades of our nation, wealth was the primary moving target in the right to vote. In general, at the beginning, only landowners could vote. The idea was if you owned land, you had a vested interest in the laws governing your land, so only you and fellow landowners should be able to decide who makes those laws. But over the first 50 years, provisions requiring land ownership waned. As new states were admitted to the Union, not one of them put that requirement in their state constitution, partly because most residents already owned land and partly because they wanted more people to move there. In the original 13 states, as cities grew and many people rented rather than owning their home and business, requirements for land ownership were slowly dropped. In some cases, they were replaced by a minimum wealth requirement or a tax. This served the purpose of keeping poor people from voting, which is what land ownership rules were really all about. Now, one result of this shift away from requiring land ownership in order to vote was fascinating: the rise of publicly funded education. As more poor people became voters, they voted for things that wouldn't just help the wealthy landowners, but helped them as well, and public education boosted upward mobility. Primarily, voting was still limited to white men only, and the federal government stayed out of the debate of who should even be allowed to vote. Then came the Civil War, followed by the 14th and 15th Amendments, and suddenly the federal government was deeply involved in voting rights. The 14th Amendment defined a citizen as all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. In addition, Section 2 calls for states to lose representation in the House if they don't allow all male inhabitants 21 and older to vote, unless they've been convicted of a crime. That definition of citizenship is vital because the 15th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." And here's where things start to get complex. With the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877, many white people looked for ways to stop black people from voting, and starting in the 1890s, they turned heavily to literacy tests. The idea was simple: keep black people out of the schools and then require some level of education in order to vote. That way, the tests weren't officially targeting black people, but that was the result. In addition, the tests and testing procedures could be tailored to the voter. Preferred voters, that is to say, white voters, could be given easier tests. They could also be given tests over and over until they passed one. And finally, the ultimate arbiter of who passed a test was a white judge. So in light of the 14th Amendment that says that states lose representation in the House if they don't let people vote, how did states get away with it? Well, sadly, the amendment has no enforcement mechanism, and Congress never got around to creating one, so it's never been enforced. In 1949, the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's literacy test was unconstitutional because it was used for the express purpose of disenfranchising black voters. But it was a highly limited ruling, so it wasn't until passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that literacy tests were completely prohibited. And then things get more complicated. As obvious methods of disenfranchising certain groups of people are outlawed, those who want to limit voting come up with ever more subtle ways to achieve their ends. For example, some states passed voter ID laws that require the name on the ID being used to match exactly the name on a person's voter registration card. This hurt a lot of women because, as women get married or divorced, many change their name, and if they didn't get around to changing their registration card, they weren't allowed to vote. Fortunately, states have been backing away from this exact match requirement. Texas dropped its requirement in 2013, and Georgia followed suit in 2019. In general, voter ID laws are still being pushed, but the major effort to suppress the vote has largely moved on to other tactics. A major rationalization for all these voter suppression tactics is claiming to prevent voter fraud, which they say has been running rampant. But the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing organization, claims to have documented over 1,300 cases of voter fraud. That's 1,300 cases across the entire country, going all the way back to 1982, which means fewer than 35 cases a year in the entire country. When the 2000 election ended in chaos, particularly in Florida, people began to understand that voting isn't nearly as simple as they thought. Even the ballot design could trip them up. So the first attempt to fix it was the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, and it was a disaster. This bill didn't really do much to make voting easier. It did, however, allow several corporations to move into the voting machine making business and profit handily. And it also introduced a new problem: untraceable touchscreen voting systems. After the 2016 election, there was an attempt to recount votes in several states. In Pennsylvania, however, the attempt was stymied because a lot of counties use these touchscreen machines and there weren't any ballots to recount. And today, about a dozen states still use these machines. But it almost doesn't matter what type of voting system is used if polling places are shut down or located in hard-to-reach areas, or if there aren't enough voting machines for people to vote on, resulting in people having to wait online hours just to get in to vote. And it's being done in many states. Also, in the last decade, voter roll purges have been used. Now, they do eliminate a lot of dead weight from the voter rolls, but they also remove a lot of eligible voters, denying them the opportunity to vote, often in close elections. This tactic has passed its peak as voting rights groups are fighting back, but it's still being used. Most recently, states across the country are passing laws designed to make it harder to vote by shortening voting times, reducing or eliminating early voting days, making it harder to vote absentee, eliminating polling places, and adding other oddball rules. One such oddball rule is a prohibition on bringing water to people who have to wait in long lines to vote, on the spurious notion that the water is some sort of bribe. Supporters of this prohibition say they're just expanding a restriction on electioneering too close to a polling place. Now, as long as the line doesn't extend beyond that radius, no problem. But if the tactics that I've already listed cause lines to extend well past that radius, well then people can try and sway voters when they're waiting in line to vote. The same people who are causing the long lines don't want to pay the political price. There is a major sign of hope, however, that even all these tactics will fail to discourage voting, and that hope is in the number of people who voted in 2020. For the first time ever, over 45% of all Americans, not just eligible voters, but counting everyone who lives in America, over 45% voted. And that's 2/3 of eligible voters, the highest percentage since 1900. Now, this is probably a mix of two factors. The first is the Trump factor. His enormously polarizing, bombastic style inspired millions of people to vote, both for and against him. How many of those people will vote again? Well, maybe it depends on how well they're inspired. Most of those people aren't going to take kindly to new ways to try to shut them out. They're going to find ways around those new barriers, and they're not going to vote for the people who put those barriers up. We're already seeing evidence of this continuing effect as voter registration numbers, particularly for Democrats, continue to climb, while Republican registrations have actually declined in many parts of the country. Now, that doesn't mean we can relax. We still need to fight against partisan efforts to stop people from voting. But we can take hope from current trends that if we continue to fight, we can win, not just the current battle for voting rights, but several elections to come. So how are you helping? Are you registering voters? Are you organizing? Are you participating actively in campaigns for candidates who want to expand voting rights? What other ideas do you have to get more Americans to the polls? Put your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And make sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to this channel so you can see more videos as they come out. There are a lot of progressive solutions. As always, thanks for watching. Stay progressive.